Hello everyone, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about the Theaetetus section or numbers 151d to e. And this will now be our second definition of knowledge. Remember, knowledge was in the ancient Greek, episteme, and in this discussion, episteme in the second definition will be aesthesis. And we'll look a little bit today in this lecture of the notion of aesthesis as a viable equivalency for episteme, and ultimately we're really asking the question, remember the central question of the Theaetetus is, what is knowledge? Earlier on, Socrates was stimulated to this question by the question of, well, what's Sophia? Sophia seems to be something that helps us learn. Learning seems connected with knowledge, so you have Sophia connected to episteme. And then Theaetetus says in the first definition, he says, well, episteme seems to be something like this. A series of examples. So, in other words, I'm not sure what episteme really is, but I know it when I see it. Socrates, as we've seen, criticized that, says, no, I want a definition. So, the second real definition after the first attempt of just enumeration, the one that Theaetetus comes up with, he says, okay, I'm going to say episteme is aesthesis. And aesthesis translates as perception. It's not a bad translation, and we'll look a little bit at the nuances of the term perception in English, and we'll get an idea that it does handle some of the nuances in the original Greek. So, after this, the midwife digression, Socrates says, okay, give it another shot, Theaetetus. What do you think episteme is? And he says very clearly, well, Socrates, it seems to me that when one knows something, so this isn't quite exactly what's in the text, but when one knows something, so I'm just letting this little X stand for whatever, something. Now keep in mind that something can take on all kinds of different instantiations, and we'll worry about that in a minute, so just hang on. So just in general, when you know something, so this is kind of an off-the-cuff thing. When you know something, you're perceiving it, at least at the time of the knowing. So in this sense, Theaetetus gives Socrates a very open-ended kind of answer. Well, you know, when I know something, well, it seems to be that I'm sort of looking at it or perceiving it or I'm aware of it or something at the time of the knowing. Kind of like in our colloquial expressions like, seeing is believing, so it has sort of a link with believing, some kind of subjective state. Also, when you say, yeah, I know something, there's another aspect, another dimension to this notion of knowing, this episteme, this kind of a state that the mind is in, right? And what's that state? Well, when you think about it, when you say, yeah, I know that like this book is on the table, or that this board is fixed to the wall, or that I like chocolate ice cream. When I say things like that I know something, there seems to be a kind of awareness, there seems to be an object of awareness, but there's also a strong sense of certainty. Like if I say, well, what do you think will happen, you know, tomorrow, or what do you think the weather will be like? And you say, well, I think it'll be sunny for the picnic. And I say, yeah, but do you know that? You'll say something like, well, I don't know that. I just think it or I believe it. So you'll retract. We tend to pull back a bit when someone says, do you really know something? And we think, am I really sure of it? So what Theaetetus is bringing out here is that knowledge, when we use that term knowledge, episteme, we're really talking about something that's really certain. This subjective feeling of certainty that it's not wrong. It would be odd to say that I know something and I'm wrong. So in that sense, when you know something, it's linked to certainty. So in the background of all this is the notion of you are certain. That link between that link between the concept of epistemic knowledge and certainty is going to be in, shall we say, a part of Western thought and philosophy for centuries. Now, you might be thinking, well, why did they make that link? What was so important about it? One of the things that was going on at the time was where the school of skepticism, where they wanted to say there really wasn't. The skeptics said there's no such thing as knowledge. That's not even in the game here. If you read this dialogue, the notion that there's no knowledge, the viewpoint that there's nothing like episteme, this view that episteme maybe is just some myth or whatever, that don't even worry about defining it because it's not real. No, that's not even part of the game. Not at all. So put that one to the side. Plato, through his mouthpiece of Socrates, with Theaetetus, they're not even discussing whether or not knowledge is possible. Notice that is not a question. Is there episteme at all, my dear Theaetetus? Socrates never asks that question. He immediately says, there's learning, there's Sophia, there's wisdom, there's episteme. What are we talking about? What is it? So remember, the presupposition is that there is knowledge, there is episteme, and the second presupposition is that we can recognize it, right? Because Theaetetus, in our first definition, he recognized, he said, it's all the things that Theodorus does, and in addition to math, it's cobbling, and there's all kinds of examples of knowledge. So the existence of knowledge is not on the table. But we've added a little bit more. Not just does knowledge exist, but knowledge has to be certain, right? So again, it seems that there is a number of presuppositions that are built in here. So when Socrates says, yeah, I know nothing, I'm totally ignorant, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because he's not confessing to total ignorance of the whole issue, but he is confessing more or less to the content. But be on your guard, because we have already slipped in a few things that episteme exists, and we've got a characteristic of it. And we've got some other character. It's kind of connected to an activity, and there's connected to an awareness. So there's characteristics coming in. So it's not a total, shall we say, blank slate here. We've got some characteristics going. We're going to see how the details are filled in. So right away, we could make the argument, if you like, that the dialogue does give us some answers as to what episteme is, even if we don't get a full and detailed and, full-blooded, robust answer. It's still the case that we've got some more insights into the Greek view, certainly the Socratic view at this stage, and the Platonic view of what episteme knowledge is. And we've got something. It's something that's certain. Right? Remember, at the time, there were lots of people that disagreed with this, that there wasn't such a thing as knowledge, that was all illusory, and those were the skeptics. And Socrates does battle with the skeptics in many places in the dialogues, but not here. Consider he's also teaching a young fellow. Remember, our Theaetetus is just a lad of about 16, 17. So he's not doing everything at once. He's teaching him at least about a concept. And as we've seen earlier, he's basing his teaching on what Theaetetus has already done, as we saw, namely the discussion of powers in mathematics. All right, so episteme is, he says, when one knows, episteme is simply aesthesis. So we've got an activity and an awareness, and there's various ways that it's translated, but episteme is simply aesthesis, is nothing other than aesthesis. So what we've got is an equivalency between these two concepts. Right? So they're linked very tightly together. And this has caused a number of discussions in the philosophical journals of really how to interpret even this original link between episteme and aesthesis. That's not going to occur. That's not going to occupy us here, but that is already something that some scholars would like to argue about. What exactly is the link that's being made here? But for us, we're going to just sort of take it fairly easily at first glance that he's just equating the concepts. And now our job is to think about this term aesthesis, which, as I said, is translated as perception. Not a bad translation. So, given that perception is a pretty good translation for aesthesis, we have to be careful because even our own terms, remember, a lot of the language that you grew up speaking or learned or whatever that's around today, words are tricky. They often have several meanings. And sometimes it's easy to think that the most general use, the most general meaning of a term is the total meaning of the term. Not so much. Not that sometimes is not the case. In other words, we sometimes use terms in a variety of ways, but maybe it has one more dominant sense, but it has its subsidiary ones, and they're important too. Well, let's think about the ways that we use perception and why it's not a bad translation for aesthesis. Here's about three ways that we use it. So the first I've listed as sense perception. The second, what I called a propositional perception. And the other one, number 3, is a dream perception. So 1, 2, and 3. And notice in this propositional perception, that one also ramifies, splits into 2 parts, concrete and abstract. What I'm trying to get across here is this notion of perception shouldn't be simply, solely identified with sense perception. That's the most common way, I suspect, that we use the word perception when you're perceiving something. Right? So, like an object perception. So let's talk a little bit about that. I perceive the hat, or I perceive the cup, the book. When I'm talking about sense perception, it tends to be perception of objects. Right? Nothing strange here. Just books, tables, soup spoons, horse carriages, automobiles, and the like. Objects in the world. If you want to be a little fancier, you could say, I perceive things that are spatio-temporal. They're in space and they're in time. In that sense, you are perceiving just simple objects. We'll call this a kind of object perception, sense perception. And of course, you perceive also by touch. You know, you perceive when you're listening to music. So the notion of sense perception is just that, through the senses. Touching, tasting, I perceive the taste of broccoli or whatnot. Now, what's also going on in perception that we should be thinking about, and it goes back to this notion of not simply an activity but an awareness, because if I say to you, when you're perceiving the cup, and let's say you're totally into the perception of the cup, or even better, maybe you're totally into the perception of music, and I see and you're listening to music, and I see that you're doing all the things that humans tend to do when they're seriously perceiving music, and you're grooving to the tune, or if it's maybe some classical music, you're, just in rapture. And then I say to you, what are you doing? Just all of a sudden, I just say, what are you doing? You would say to me, I'm listening to music. Don't bug me, right? You've interrupted me. I was really into it, and you pulled me out of it. So, while you were really into it, you were also, in a sense, aware of what you were doing. It's not the case that you were really into it and you were totally lost in it. That doesn't seem to really be how we function. That can happen too, no question. But by and large, this notion of perception, aesthesis, comes with something that is seen and an action, an activity. Could be passive too, right? I'm not saying it necessarily is something active. Could be passive, that you're letting the notes wash over you. It's a passive act, yes. The music is stimulating you. Oh, that's fine. We can think of it that way. But it is a kind of activity of the mind, and there is an awareness. Jean-Paul Sartre has a great example, as he tends to, always has these good examples. He says, when you're counting your cigarettes in the cafe, and someone says, what do? And you say, don't interrupt me. I'm counting. I know what I'm doing, but I don't want to lose track. So in this idea of aesthesis, it is perception of objects in the world, that like spatiotemporal objects, and there's an awareness that you're doing so. And That's not quite the only thing, though. There's a little bit more complicated, because you might say, well, I not only perceive objects, because if they were limited to just objects, you'd say something like this. Well, I don't just perceive that cup. I don't perceive just the book. I don't perceive simple objects in isolation. How do you perceive objects? Well, if you think about it, you actually have you have levels of perception. There's a bit more complexity than just objects. Yeah, sometimes you just concentrate on the taste of that pizza, and that's sort of the only thing that you're really perceiving. But really, you have what is sometimes referred to as propositional perception. And what does that mean? Well, think of these two objects here. You are perceiving not just a book and a cup. You also, if I said to you something like this, when you looked at the book and the cup, and I spoke to you in a language you understand, so I'm speaking to you in English, and I said, what do you see over here? What are you perceiving? You'd say a book and a cup. And I say, no, what are you really perceiving? You probably, if I pressed it a little bit, you'd probably say, well, I see that the book is to the side of the cup. Well, from your perspective, the book is to the right of the cup is to the left of the book. Book and the cup are a small set of things on the table. You could talk about not just perceiving the objects, but perceiving a certain order of the objects, because they're not just flying around, right? They're sitting on the table. And of course, if I do this, then your perception of the order of those objects would change, on top of, in front of, behind, to the left of, to the right of. So it's a little bit more complex than just simple object perception. So in the concrete one, you will have perception of objects in relation. Okay? In other words, sometimes philosophers, mostly associated with the philosopher Wittgenstein, we have some grasp of states of affairs. What's the state of affairs? Book and a cup next to each other on the table. And you could get into more details as you like, but roughly you have a propositional type of perception. You see states the way the world is, states of affairs. Well, in addition to your propositional perception in a concrete sense, there's also a kind of abstract sense to it as well. So we don't want to limit ourselves to simple objects that are located by the senses or in sense perception. There's an abstract one too. So in this sense, the objects that were common, like objects here of sense perception, objects here of sense perception, but now in relation, here we have a more abstract one, and I'll give an example. Something like that. You also have a kind of awareness of these things as well. It's not clear as to all the elements that are going on in aesthesis. We'll be working that out as we go more through the arguments of the Theaetetus. But we do use perception in this way as well. Oh, I get it. Yeah, 2 + 2 is 4. And there was a time in your life. You may laugh, but there was a time in your life when you did go, oh yeah, I get that now. Because there was a time in your life when you didn't understand 2 + 2 is equal to 4. And if you don't believe me, go talk to a small child who hasn't really learned how to count and ask what 2 + 2 is equal to 4. They have no clue what you're talking about. And they will guess, and they'll say 5, 6, whatever, they don't know. Or if they guess right, they just guessed. They don't know these things. Now, with this, you have, notice the objects now, and I'm going to put it in scare quotes, right? So the objects here objects in relation again, we seem to have a kind of perception of those too. Some people even thought we had perceptions of, like, pure objects, like mathematical objects. That's the way we sometimes do it too. We sometimes talk like that as well. Anyways, what I'm just trying to get at here is that we have some abstract notion of perception, and these are kind of objects in relation, and we're now talking about very abstract objects. All right, so we've got different uses of perception. The final one that I want to mention is again slightly different, but we do talk about it. Socrates will, later on, when he's examining various arguments, he will bring forth an argument that is based on dreams, and we'll look at that in due course. But in dream perception, we do say, yeah, I had a dream last night. And you'll say things like, yeah, I remember I was walking, what happened in the dream? Well, I was walking along a beach, and all of a sudden I saw this huge whale, or I saw a bunch of seagulls, or whatever. Notice you are using terms like, when I was walking along the beach, right, you were perceiving that you were in this environment, and you perceived seagulls going. Now you might say, well, those were dream seagulls. Fine. But you still would use the term perceived them. Do you see in a dream? Well, sort of. It's a dream seeing, so it's a dream perceiving. But nonetheless, we still talk about it as a kind of perceiving. So in this sense, you would, dream perception, obviously, you would have, again, kind of objects, and they too would be in relations. Because you would be able to say things like, yeah, I saw the gulls flying overhead. So there is a spatial dimension there. And then before I saw the gulls, I saw a whale. So there would be objects in relations as well. So the same thing as almost kind of like this, right? Except now, what's going on here? Well, the three ways that we use perception with these, well, we say here, and again, there's some debate, there's lots of debate over this, but I'm just talking about the way we ordinarily use terms. We tend to think of these objects as these are sort of independent type objects. But this one here, these ones seem to be dependent because they're part of the mind. Right? Those dream gulls weren't the same as we would say, well, those were just dream gulls. Those weren't real gulls. Those was a dream whale. It wasn't a real whale. Okay, so what have we got? Well, A's thesis is activity, awareness. There's a certainty there. There's a variety of ways we can think of it. So there's lots for Socrates to chew on in this example. And again, but what's always common is that you are basically aware of what's going on, right? Even, you might say, wait a second, not in dreams. Well, that's not always true either, because a lot of times in dreams, have you ever had the experience where, certainly when you wake up, you're like, oh, that was either, oh, too bad that was a dream, or, and I wish it were real, or thank God that was a dream, thank God it's not real. Or sometimes we become lucid during dreams, right? Sometimes when you're trying to do something in a dream, like, you know, lots of people have dreams where they're trying to walk down a hallway and get out of a building or something like that, and it never works, or some ridiculous series of sort of pratfalls and instances happen, and we often can say, oh, this is just a dream, and you kind of force yourself to wake up. So even the awareness of it can happen in the dreams too. So what we've got is that in all cases there is this active perceiving, there's this awareness, there's this certainty of the act of perceiving. And what I want to look at now is a little bit more at this notion of certainty. Okay, so we've got all these different levels, but this activity that we have that is certain, what does that mean? So let's just conclude by looking, what does that mean when we say it's certain? We have to be careful about this, because you can say something like this. Well, the other day I perceived a dragon. And we would say, well, no, you couldn't have actually perceived a dragon, because dragons don't exist. You must have seen, maybe you saw something like a picture of a dragon or whatever. But notice what both of those imaginary participants in a discussion would agree on, that perception took place. So the notion of the certainty here is not necessarily a certainty. It's not about the existence of the object of perception. It's not about whether or not the dragon really exists. That's not where the certainty is. It's not whether or not the dragon had particular properties, like it was blue or whatnot. I mean, all those things could be wrong. Those are judgments about the perception. Rather, what are you certain about? That the perception happened. Or better yet, because happened relies on memory, that the perception is happening. So if someone were to say to you, what are you doing? And you say, I'm perceiving whatever it happens to be you're perceiving. Someone could get you to doubt that maybe, oh, well, you're not really perceiving water over there. That's an illusion, right? You say, okay, maybe that's an illusion. But it would be odd if someone said to you, you're not perceiving anything at all. And by not perceiving anything at all, you're not even perceiving, right? So you could be wrong, perhaps, about what you think you're perceiving when you make judgments about it, but that you're perceiving, you couldn't be wrong about it. And that you might be perceiving some property, it's hard to think of being wrong about that. So that the perception and happened, or better yet, is happening. And what exactly you're seeing at that moment, you are seeing that particular thing at the moment. Sounds a little bit more complex. Now, I'll explain what I mean in a second. So what we want to be very careful about, and Plato's going to be having Socrates distinguish this very carefully later, is the notion of perception and its immediate data and its immediate sort of raw feels that we get, or raw sensations, and the judgments we make about those sensations. So get your head around that, because it's the certainty that attaches to the raw feels. So it's like this. If I say something like, okay, right now, I see a red patch, like I see a kind of red patch. I could be wrong if I then say, well, I think that red patch is really on the wall, and I find out, no, something is wrong with my eyes or something, and I'm seeing red patches, and then I'm judging that they're on the wall, but really it's just something gone wrong with my eyes. Well, that could be fine, because if you're perhaps colorblind or something, you might see things a color incorrectly, where you'll say, oh, that looks like green, and people say, no, actually it's not green, it's a different color. But you would say, looks like green to me, right? Could you be wrong about that? Could you say, it looks like green to me, but it really doesn't look like green to you? That seems to be very odd. That's where the certainty is, not in the judgment about what you're talking about, but in the raw feels. And this gets into kind of confusing territories, because we reinterpret. Think about when you, quote unquote, develop a taste for something. Most people use examples of things like wine and beer. Most human beings do not like their first taste of that stuff, right? Most people just, ugh. And why is that? Well, there's a whole story as to it. But what happens later on? You develop a taste. So the original experience is still of that taste, but you have a different judgment about it. You see it, you feel it, you taste it, and you experience it in a slightly different way. But it's still that particular taste. So what we want to be careful about is where the certainty attaches, not to judgments about what we're experiencing, but that we're experiencing what we're experiencing in a given moment. Right? So not in our memories about it. That's why I said it's not so good to think about happen, but it's happening. And that's really what's going on in this. When you know it, when something knows it, one is perceiving it. So it's that tight link that is starting off the discussion, that A's thesis has an awareness, and what's going on in this immediate awareness cannot logically, sensibly be doubted. You're certain of it. I can't see a green patch and say, well, I don't think I'm seeing a green patch. I can say things like, well, I'm seeing a green patch, but I'm not sure if that's a trick of my imagination, a trick of light. I'm not sure what to infer, what to judge about it. But that, or you know, if I feel something poking my wrist, right? I could be dreaming right now, maybe make a mistake, or something is going on to make me sense this. But that I'm sensing it at the given moment, that doesn't seem to be something that can be rationally, logically doubted. You can say you're doubting all kinds of things, but it seems that if you doubt that you're perceiving, there is some kind of logical problem about doubting the act of perception while you're actually in the act of perception. So that's the thing that's going to lay a little bit of the groundwork. But keep in mind, so that already we've got some answers about what episteme is linked to, namely aesthesis, and it's linked to a variety of ways that we perceive, and that it's activity and awareness. But that's not by any means the end of the story. It's only the beginning. See you next video.